welcome to the deep dive. This is your shortcut to getting your head around complex stuff. We skip the endless searching, take the sources you're interested in, and, well, we dive deep. It's all tailored for you, the learner, who wants solid understanding, without getting buried in information.
Exactly. And for our first dive, and this is just the start of a longer journey, we hope we're looking at the very beginnings of yoga. We've got two major sources on the table, the Rigveda and the Upanishads. These aren't just old texts. They're really foundational for, well, a huge amount of Indian thought. Our mission here is to see how yoga first pops up, how it starts taking shape in these, frankly, monumental texts.
Yeah, and even if you think you know yoga, I suspect there'll be some surprises. We're going to trace how these very first ideas, sometimes quite different from modern yoga, evolved, how they became a more structured kind of philosophy, a set of practices. It's a real evolution story. So, yoga. Ancient, complex. Where do we even begin?
Well, the word itself seems like the logical place, doesn't it? Yoga. It comes from Sanskrit. The root is yuj. And it's got this interesting dual meaning, to unite or to join, but also to yoke or to control.
Unite and control, okay.
Yeah, and that root word kind of captures the whole essence, really. It's about bringing things together. Maybe the individual self uniting with, a bigger universal consciousness, or maybe more practically, like you might feel it, harmonizing your body, your mind, your spirit.
So, connection, bringing parts together into a whole. Is that the core idea?
That's fundamentally it. And it's important to remember, yoga isn't just one single thing. Across Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, the term yoga covers a whole range of practices.
Right, different traditions, different takes.
Exactly. But these practices, they tend to share a common goal, gaining control. Control over the body and control over the mind, which can often be pretty chaotic. And usually these practices are tied into bigger goals within those traditions, like salvation or liberation.
Okay, so union, control, different traditions.
Oh.
Got it. Let's go way back. The Rigveda, you said it's super old. What did the earliest mentions actually look like? Are they even recognizable as yoga?
It is incredibly old, yeah. We're talking maybe starting around 1500 BCE. It's foundational for Hinduism.
Yeah.
And yes, inside its hymns, we find things that you could see as the seeds of later yoga. There's hymn 5.81.1, for instance. The root yuj shows up there.
Ah, the root word again.
Yes, but here the context often leads translators to use yoke or control. Think about yoking animals.
Like yoking oxen to a plow, that kind of image. Very earthy.
Exactly that. Very grounded. And this particular hymn, it's actually to the rising sun god. And there's a line talking about seers who yogically control their minds and their intelligence. The Sanskrit word is yunjante. You can hear the yuj right in there.
Wow. So even back then, 1500 BCE, there's this idea of actively sort of harnessing the mind.
Precisely. Actively directing your thoughts, your intelligence. It's fascinating.
And connecting it to the sun god. That's interesting, too. A different vibe to maybe modern mindfulness. What else is in the Rigveda?
Well, there's another really compelling bit. The Keśin hymn. That's 10.136. Probably a bit later, maybe 1000 BCE. It describes this figure, the Keśin, literally the long-haired one.
Long-haired one, of course.
And what's intriguing is this figure seems, well, different. Not part of the usual priestly, the Brahminic structure. The hymn paints a picture of someone detached, maybe even experiencing altered states, doing contemplative things.
So like an outsider, someone on the fringes doing something that sounds a bit like early yoga.
That's a great way to put it. It strongly suggests that these kinds of ascetic practices, maybe early forms of yoga, might have existed outside the main religious rituals of the time. It gives us this hint that maybe the spiritual landscape was broader, more diverse than just the official stuff.
Right, maybe not just handed down from the top priests.
Possibly. We hear about ascetic groups, sometimes called Keśins, these long-haired ones. It's plausible they were involved in these early forms. It suggests that, the quest for spiritual insight wasn't just for the established elite. Maybe a more individual thing, too.
So the roots might be more spread out, less centralized than we sometimes think.
That seems quite likely, yeah. And another little linguistic clue, the Rigveda in hymn X.71.9 uses the word tantra.
Tantra, like that tantra.
Well, hold on. Much later, tantra gets complex connotations. But here, in this context, it seems to just mean technique. Or maybe loom, like weaving. The key thing is the idea of a method, a structured way to do something, which, definitely hints at the more systematic yoga that comes later.
Just a technique. Okay, so adding it all up, the Rigveda, It's not just old hymns, it could be the actual starting point for classical yoga, and maybe even other Indian traditions too.
It's a strong possibility. It really lays down some foundational ideas, these first little sparks. Now, if we jump forward a bit, maybe a few centuries, we get to the Upanishads.
Okay, the Upanishads. I've heard of those. More philosophical, right?
Much more philosophical, yes. Composed roughly, say, 800 down to 200 BCE. And they take those seeds we saw in the Rigveda and really start to cultivate them. They make things more defined, philosophically deeper.
So this is where yoga starts looking more like a distinct path, a discipline we might recognize.
In many ways, yeah. The Upanishads are digging into huge questions. What's reality? What's the self, the Atman? What's the ultimate reality, Brahman? And within all that big thinking, yoga starts to emerge as a really important tool.
A tool for what?
For achieving spiritual liberation, moksha. For understanding your true self-realization. The Upanishads are basically the philosophical foundation for Vedanta, a major school of Hindu thought.
Okay, concrete examples. What do they say about yoga?
Well, take the Katha Upanishad, probably 5th to 3rd century BCE. It gives a pretty clear definition. Yoga is the steady control of the senses. And that leads to a supreme state.
Steady control of the senses. Okay, that's starting to sound familiar, like the mental discipline aspect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It says yoga is this mental stability you get by, reining in the senses and understanding yourself, the Atman, as this eternal reality. Yeah. You can see the connection to modern ideas of focus and turning inward.
Definitely. What else? More details.
Oh, yes. The Shvetashvatara Upanishad, maybe late first millennium BCE, gets really specific. It actually talks about techniques.
Like postures?
Yeah. It mentions holding the upper body erect. It talks about withdrawing the mind and senses into the heart. It even gives instructions for breath control pranayama through the nostrils, trying to make the breath subtle, diminish it.
Wow. Okay. That's moving from concept to actual practice, like a manual.
It really is. And he uses that powerful image, again, trying to control the mind is like trying to yoke wild horses.
Huh. Yeah, I can relate to that one.
Most people probably can. And get this, it even suggests the best place to practice. Somewhere level, clear, quiet, maybe a cave.
A cave. Seriously.
Seriously. Protected from wind, maybe nice sounds like water nearby. It's like an ancient guide to creating your yoga space.
That's amazing. Finding the right environment for inner work, way back then. Did it mention results? Like what happens if you do all this?
It does. It mentions potential results or achievements called siddhis.
Siddhis. Like powers.
Sort of. Maybe more like perfections or signs of mastery, things like freedom from sickness, from aging, even death.
Whoa! Okay. That's ambitious.
It sounds extraordinary, yeah. Also things like feeling light, good health, mental steadiness, even improved skin, a nice voice, pleasant smell, minimal, bodily waste.
Quite the list. Almost sounds supernatural, or maybe just profound physical and mental shifts from intense practice.
It reflects that ancient belief in transformation through yoga, transcending limitations. And there's a beautiful line in there too. Yoking first the mind, discerning the light of fire, the transformative sun Savita brought it forth from the earth. People often read that as controlling the lower mind to awaken higher intelligence, that inner light. Again, linking back to those themes of control and elimination.
Okay, I'm definitely seeing a progression. Rigveda hints at yoking the mind. Upanishads give actual techniques, places to practice, expected results.
Exactly. And it gets even more systematic. The Maitreya Upanishad, in its 6th chapter, lays out what it calls sixfold yoga, Sadanga yoga.
Sixfold, like 6 steps.
6 limbs or components it lists. Pranayama, breath control. Pratyahara, withdrawing the senses. Dhyana, meditation. Dharana, concentration, like fixing the mind. Tarka, this can mean logic, reasoning, or maybe introspection. And finally, samadhi, deep spiritual union or absorption.
Pratyahara, meditation, concentration. Okay, now we're seeing elements really central to modern yoga. This is a big step towards a system.
It really is. And this Upanishad also talks about shedding your karma, good and bad deeds. It describes seeing a golden inner sun, representing Brahman within you. It even mentions entering higher states of consciousness, like Turiya, beyond waking, dreaming, deep sleep.
So yoga is becoming this really well-defined path towards liberation, towards self-understanding in the Upanishads.
Absolutely. And look, while those are some key examples, other Upanishads chip in too. The Brihadaranyaka, one of the oldest, mentions pranayama way back, maybe 900 BCE. The Chandogya talks about prana, life energy, and pratyahara, sense withdrawal. Even earlier texts mention breath control, mantra repetition. The Taittiriya calls yoga mastery of body and senses. And the Maitrayani Upanishad also describes a six-fold method, similar to the Maitri one. It's a developing theme across these texts.
So it's not just one text, but this thread weaving through many Upanishads, all pointing towards controlling mind and body for spiritual growth.
That's the picture, yeah. So if you trace it, Rigveda gives the initial, maybe metaphorical hints, mental control, union, plus that interesting Keśin figure, the outsider ascetic. Then the Upanishads grab those ideas and run with them. They give specific techniques, pranayama, pratyahara, dhyana, samadhi. They firmly plant yoga as a way to get free from suffering, from the cycle of rebirth.
It's pretty amazing to think these texts from millennia ago laid out the basics for something so widespread today.
And what's really striking, especially if you know later yoga philosophy like the Yoga Sutras, is how many core ideas overlap with the Upanishads. Things like the modes of nature, gunas, using mantras, contemplating Brahman, restraining mind, body, speech,
Right.
detachment, renunciation, purification, stabilizing the mind, devotion to the self, the whole idea of being caught in birth and death, samsara, mental chatter, afflictions, self-realization, self-control.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is. Transcendental states, mystic powers, siddhis again, ethics, selfless service. It's like the Upanishads provided the philosophical DNA for so much of what came later in yoga.
So the Upanishads really gave it that philosophical depth, that structure. Rigveda lit the spark, Upanishads built the early fire.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so wrapping up this first dive then, looking at the Rigveda and Upanishads shows yoga has this incredibly deep history. We saw it evolve from those early Vedic hints about control and connection to much more detailed techniques and a whole philosophical system in the Upanishadic era.
Definitely. These texts show that the core ideas of yoga aren't new fads. They've been worked with, explored, refined for thousands of years. It's a profoundly rich tradition.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Those fundamental ideas, union and control, that need to connect to something bigger, to get a handle on ourselves. How much of that original impulse still drives people in yoga studios today? After all this time, all these changes, what basic human need does that speak to? Something to maybe chew on as we get ready for our next deep dive into yoga's journey.
A really important question. It shows how these ancient ideas can still feel incredibly relevant, even now.